how does a neural network learns? Because you talked about, creating it with the brain model and, the prefrontal cortex, of the mice and putting those EEG on the headset. But how does a neural network then learns? Is it by saving data? Is it by, intelligent algorithm that's there? Or is it by experiencing things by, different senses? Or so yeah, what do you think about it?
So when you say neural network, do you mean the neural network in the brain, or are you referring towards neural network, artificial neural network?
Right. Let's start with the biological brain.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So there are different principles through which actually neurons learn, and the primary thing is like in one case you need data to actually learn, which means you need some stimulus actually to learn. And
Right.
then in some cases you don't need stimulus as well, right? I will try to explain both of these categories
Sure.
as well. But on a simplest level, you can imagine like a single neuron in the brain. Let's talk about visual cortex, which is the area where most of the visual processing is done. In that region, although you have so many neurons, but for a single neuron is connected to a lot of other neurons, in some cases thousands and thousands of neurons. Now, if I'm a neuron and sitting somewhere in between different regions, then actually I have some input connections and I have some output connections to the other neurons. Now, I'm receiving input connections from other neurons, and I'm also actually sending my output signal to other neurons as well, through which I'm connected, right? And you can imagine something similar when you think of like a high-level model of artificial neural network. You see those input layers, you see those hidden layers, and you see those output layers as well, where most of them are, connected with each other. Now, let's say if I present an image, and let's say this neuron spikes, which is connected to a lot of neurons from the input and output. Now, in that sense, what it actually means for that single neuron is that it has a preferred stimulus, what we just presented, right? And let's say we present another image, then that neuron does not spike, which actually means like we had a preferred stimulus, which is the previous image or the previous stimulus. And if we look at that previous image as well, then we can try to find what is interesting in that image, which means, is there any specific features in that image which that neuron is sensitive to? Could those be edges oriented at different angles? Or could those be anything else as well, for instance?
Right.
Now, the way this learning is happening is, and there is a very famous, those who sort of like wire together, fire together, or those who fire together, wire together. What it actually means, if two neurons, they share their spiking behavior with each other, then they actually strongly wire and connect with each other as well. And the way that, and this is actually a very strong postulate of learning, because what it happens is, if my input neuron is actually giving me a signal, and if I respond to that neuron by selecting it from thousands of other neurons, that actually means that my learning is wired specifically to that neuron. So I'm going to listen to that neuron more preferably to any other neuron, for instance, right? But this is like a very high level sort of idiotic example that I'm trying to give to actually grasp the bigger picture. But now you can imagine there are so many different kinds of neurons in the brain. Right? There are excitatory neurons, there are inhibitory neurons, and those have further subtypes as well. And at the moment we are talking about individual neurons, now there are neural circuits as well. Neurons that are connected to other neurons, and those are actually there's a population of neurons responding to some stimulus. Right? So you can imagine like such principles. What I just try to describe these are called synaptic plasticity rules of learning. And on a high level, this is mostly found everywhere in the brain. There's these rules of like synaptic plasticity learning, and they can either make the connection stronger, so the learning stronger, or those could actually make the connections weaker as well, because if the neuron fires before me, the input neuron, then there is a strong sort of connection. But if it responds after me, then the connection becomes weak. And there's a lot of science inside the neuron why it is happening this way. But you can imagine, like, on a single neuron level, there's a very systematic way that the learning is happening. And this trickles down to the population level at the whole as well.
So it's a collection of how the neurons connect with each other and what kind of communication is happening, and a lot of data transfer as well.
True. So you mentioned data, but one thing that I didn't mention a lot in the last answer was I took it as an example of a single image, right? But you can imagine, like, throughout the day, we look at like infinite images as our visual stream, right? And this is just talking about the visual information, but there is an auditory information as well, and olfactory information and whatnot, and especially sensory information.
Right.
And in that sense, you can imagine, like, now maybe I can use a TRI model of a neural network, artificial neural network, to explain what's happening in the brain as well. So we spoke about a single image, a neuron respond to, but then you can imagine, like, we start feeding so many images to that single neuron or to a population of neurons. And then they actually themselves become tuned to some preferred stimulus or preferred features, right? So a specific neuron, let's say, is preferred to a horizontal sort of like horizontal edge detector, for instance, something like this, right? Now, whenever those neurons are going to look at any image which has those features in it, those neurons are going to respond, right? And this happens over time, because you're going to keep presenting the images, and then the neurons actually make their preference. And it's not like the specific neurons actually just going to have all the horizontal edge detectors. They're becoming all the visual space, right? And this is just a tiny example of a single pixel level, for instance, that I'm mentioning. But you can imagine, like, when you look at a complex natural image, such as a face, for instance, then we have eyes, we have nose, we have ears, and whatnot. And in that sense, if we go to the individual level on a pixel level, then those actually are edges, right? So a population of neurons that we just talked about is actually focused on detecting those edges, whereas the next population, as we go further down in the ventral stream, are actually having a bigger receptive field, which is looking at the complete eye now, right? And the complete nose and the complete face. And it is fascinating that it is quite similar to what is happening in today's deep neural network as well. Because as you trickle down deeper in the network towards sort of like the final classification layers, on a high level, this is what's happening as well. Initially, you have smaller receptive fields, and then you actually encompass the large features. And yes, I hope it answers to some extent.
Yes.